So my GoPro settings. For freestyle. ProTune on, duh. High bitrate mode, if available. That's on Hero 9 and 10, I think. I don't think the 8 had a high bitrate mode, but use the highest bitrate possible. I usually record freestyle at 2.7K 30 FPS. I think that for fast motion, the GoPro doesn't have... It uses basically... I'm not looking at the specs, so take this with a grain of salt. But my memory is that the GoPro uses basically the same bitrate for 2.7K as 4K. On the 9 and 10, this may not be true. I think it may use around 70 megabits per second for 2.7K and closer to 100 megabits per second for 4K. But the problem is fast motion, like freestyle flying, requires a high bitrate, or you just get sort of trash quality. So in my testing, at least up to the Hero 7 and the Hero 8, I haven't done this testing on the Hero 9 and 10, so grain of salt. But my testing was that 4K on the Hero 7 and 8 was pointless for freestyle because there just wasn't enough bitrate to make that resolution meaningful. It just was bad looking high 4K footage. I thought you got the best results with good looking 2.7K footage. 2.7K 30 FPS, lock ISO at 400. The reason I lock the ISO at 400 is the native ISO of the GoPro sensor. And you get, in general, you get better dynamic range from a sensor running it at its native ISO. I haven't done A/B testing to confirm this, but I'm willing to punt on it. It's going to be a little bit grainier image than ISO like 200, but it's pretty good result. Then use ND filter if necessary to adjust motion blur. Variable shutter speed, I should say auto shutter to allow auto exposure adjustment. My experience is that if you lock the shutter and the ISO, then you're guaranteed to have an overexposed or underexposed frame somewhere in your flight. If you're doing cinematic work where you have more control over the lighting, then you would lock the shutter as well. But that's not the case for freestyle. ProTune on, flat color profile and grade in post. And when I say color grade in post, I mean my editor color grades in post. I am a pretty bad color grader. So if you're not going to grade in post, I think flat still looks pretty good. But if you're not, you just take, here, basic color grade, saturation 115% to 125%, and leave as is. I mean, that looks decent in my opinion. That's not a color grade, but if you didn't want to mess with color grading. What else? Hypersmooth off, you heathens. For freestyle. Hypersmooth off for freestyle, you freaking heathens. Okay, I'm not going to die on that hill, but... What am I missing? That, I think, is it. I think that's it. What have I missed now? What's sharpness? Sharpness medium. I tried sharpness low. A lot of people say that cameras in camera sharpening is usually trash, and you should set sharpness to low and then sharpen in post. In my opinion, I just run sharpness medium because of I don't want to. I'm going to forget to sharpen it at some point, and I don't think the default sharpness looks that bad. Sharpness low on a GoPro is extremely soft. It absolutely needs sharpening to look good, in my opinion. I tried sharpness low. The mics are set to auto. The wind setting, it's set to auto. Because I do a lot of videos where I'm talking and then I fly. And if I set it manually to if I manually lock the wind setting, then it would be messed up. Oh, good point. Thank you. I knew there was something I was missing. White balance manual set to close to right for lighting, e.g. 5500 K in outdoor sun, etc. So you absolutely should set the manual white balance. Oops, I'm covering it up. You don't want the white balance changing throughout your scene because the color grade will be much more difficult. The white balance doesn't have to be perfect. Just set it close to correct for the lighting condition, and then you can manually correct it later in post, or not. But you definitely don't want it shifting. EV comp, I'd leave it 0. For 0 for most situations, I find it gets it about right. There are some situations where you might want a little bit of overexposure. The reason... Hang on. EV comp may be up to +1 for situations where you want more shadow detail at the expense of blown out highlights. That's risky, though. It's risky. Yeah. What else am I missing? I don't think is there anything else I've left? A lot of people wonder why you don't set white balance native. White balance native, it just is trash. I don't know what it's supposed to be, but it's just trash. It's the native white balance of the sensor, but what you want is you want the camera to apply the white balance correction to the raw data coming off the sensor. Because if you do it in post, you'll get worse results. Why not use ISO 100 instead of ND filters, XDo Gaming and more? I did that for a while, but my understanding, and again, I haven't done A/B testing to verify this, but I saw an expert talking, and he said that the camera will have more dynamic range, in other words, more shadow and highlight detail at its native ISO. So based on that, I'd rather run ISO 400 to get the most shadow and highlight detail. Oh, and then, then also Super View on. Super View, obviously, for freestyle, you want Super View. Why is everything else better managed in post, asks Aber the Ham. Aber, everything you can do in the camera, well, not sharpening. Most things with exposure and color are better to do in the camera, if you can. And the reason for that is the sensor gives the image process. So you've got the sensor, which is light is hitting the sensor, and the sensor is feeding image data to the image processor. And then the image processor, there is so much data coming off the sensor. If you ever actually have a camera that can record raw video, the files are enormous. There's so much data coming off the sensor that the image processor processes that data and compresses it down to something that is more manageable. So if you need to do a color correction, if you color correct the file coming here, maybe I can even demonstrate this. We're going to get a little tutorial about color science. If you color correct a processed file, you get artifacts. You get bad results. Come on, Premiere. How long does it take you to start up? It takes forever. I'm going to try and show you an example of the problem. Here, Gopro Mark 5. Video. Any minute now, that will open up. So here is, oh, this is a great example. So here is my, oh, way to go, Bardwell. This is my Lumix camera. And if we look here, here is what that looked like coming straight out of the camera. Here's what it looks like coming straight out of the camera. And then here's what it looks like with a color grade on it. Now, if we go in here and we imagine that we were trying to make a much more extreme change, okay? So the goal is to have the footage as close to correct out of the camera as possible and then work with it in post as little as possible. If I were to try to change the color temperature of this dramatically, I'm going to get, like, do you see the blotchiness on my skin here? Do you see that my forehead has become blotchy? And let me try and change the exposure too. Like here, as I change the exposure, I'm getting blotchiness here in my skin, okay? Like there's a line here across my forehead, right? This is because there's just not enough data. There's not enough color data to accurately, you're losing resolution in the color space, not in the actual resolution space. Another good example, if we look at the flight data, we look at some of the flight stuff, right? So here's a flight clip. This is actually ungraded. I put this up ungraded because I didn't want to send it back through Fabio for him to grade it. So let's not worry about that. So it is always better to do color and exposure correction in the camera because the camera has a lot more data to work with. And then when the camera gives you the finished file, any further exposure and color changes you make, you're going to be able to do a lot less with it without causing bad things to happen to the image. So there are ways to work around this. For example, pro cameras will output what's called 10-bit color. If you're outputting 10-bit color, you have a lot more latitude to screw with colors without getting these problems. But the files get a lot bigger, and pro cameras, only really pro cameras do it. GoPro doesn't do it. That's why you want to do those things in camera if at all possible. Sharpness is an exception. Sharpness, the inbuilt sharpening algorithm in most cameras is pretty bad, according to people who have opinions about such things. I personally find it acceptable and use it. And so they prefer to do their sharpening in post. Quad Doc wants to know, with your favorite GoPro settings mentioned yesterday, why is locking ISO preferred rather than setting min-max 100 to 400? Quad Doc, let's talk about that. First of all, after my discussion yesterday, where I said I thought that, where I said I locked my GoPro at ISO 400 because I had read that the GoPro's native ISO was 400 and dynamic range is best at the native ISO of the sensor. Ghost Branch FPV made a convincing argument that the GoPro's native ISO is 100. So if I can, I think he's right after our discussion. So I would set it to 100, not 400. So why am I locking the ISO rather than setting min-max? Locking the ISO, what you want, in my opinion, is for the shutter speed to be the only thing that changes. Locking the ISO at 100 will force the shutter speed to be as low as possible and give you the maximum amount of motion blur. Now, in a sunny day, you still won't get any motion blur. You still would need an ND filter. But locking the ISO at 100 means if you want a certain amount of motion blur, you want the shutter speed to be slow. And locking the ISO doesn't allow the camera to open up the ISO and keep the shutter speed low, right? So that's why I would lock it. I would want the shutter to be what is giving the exposure adjustment.